Thank you, Stefano. Thank you very much. I apologize in advance. This paper is really long. It's way too long, so I apologize especially to Father Scanone for that. I will try and highlight only the main points, and I will do so in a way that resists the typical Irish temptation just to talk really fast when you have a lot to say. What I want to start from the point that I really believe that these two recent encyclicals really provide a very good and profound roadmap for telling us where we need to go with the global economy today. But you all know that here, so I don't need to talk about the encyclicals. I'll just name the, even though they're two very different encyclicals, I think that they're very coherent and consistent in the roadmap they are presenting us for the global economy. And I'm going to just list, there's 10 points of coherence on the global economy. You maybe find more, but I found 10. So I'll just list them. Again, everything very obvious here, but I think it's useful to kind of jog your memories. So 1, a condemnation of market ideology and libertarianism. And 2, a distrust of technology completely divorced from moral responsibility. 3, an emphasis on integral human development, the idea from Pope Paul VI that it's the whole person and every person, not just material development. 4, support for the sustainable development agenda, which in my view is really a subset of integral human development, but it's very important on the world stage today. 5, a call for individual and institutional ecological conversion. The individual has to be matched by institutional reform, obvious in Laudato Si, but it's also in Caritas and Veritate too. 6, the centrality of employment for human flourishing and well-being. 7, the social responsibility of business. 8, the need for ethical finance. 9, the importance of supranational policy cooperation at the global level. And 10, the power of consumer action. That's Leonardo's voting with the wallet. And actually, Leonardo had 4 hands. I have 10 hands. Sorry. But so that just gives a brief overview of what those encyclicals say from the stuff I'm interested in, which is really the dysfunctions of the modern global economy. But I want to argue in this paper that this roadmap is a good roadmap, but it's really hard to follow a roadmap if you've gone so far down the wrong road and you're stuck in the middle of the forest and there's no lights anywhere and you can't see where you're going. Because I think that's really where we are today with the modern global economy. Now, I don't want to rehash a lot of the arguments we've all heard many times and we all know very well here. The dysfunction, the problems of the paradigm based on Homo economicus, the terrible attempts to distill ethics from economics, going back to Lionel Robbins and Pareto and all these people. And what they really did is they didn't distill values from economics. They just purged the good values and replaced them with the bad values, in my view anyway. And from what I want to say, I think the important takeaway there is we've really lost any notion of what good means, what the individual good means, especially what the common good means. Instead, we have the individual good is simply reduced to subjective, sovereign, and self-centered preferences, not subject to any ethical, dimension or, evaluation. Simply, you do what you want to do as long as you don't bump into somebody else. And of course, in this framework, there's no real role for any kind of human flourishing beyond the very basic material level. Certainly, there's no real role for relational goods or anything like that. And, human interaction is just purely based on competition, not cooperation, and we know from what we've heard that you need a proper balance between cooperation and collaboration to make the civil economy work. This kind of economy, as Amartya Sen said very famously, society or an economy can be Pareto optimal and still be perfectly disgusting. And I think Pope Francis gives us a very clear view of what disgusting means in this concept when he said that this economy kills, this economy excludes, this economy destroys Mother Earth. I think here it's useful to distinguish what Aristotle and the Greeks distinguished between oikonomia and krematistica. Oikonomia, of course, is household management. I think is actually best defined today as the ethical rules for managing both public and private household cannot be divorced from ethics, which means it can't be divorced from the good or the common good, whereas of course crematistica is seeking wealth for its own sake, based solely on greed, no connection with human flourishing, no connection with the common good. And I defer, and Paul had a very nice presentation this morning on the financial sector, which I would argue is peak crematistica. I mean, this is about as crematistic as you can get, the behavior and the structure of the modern financial sector. But how do we fix this? How do we get this roadmap to work for us again? Now, I think I want to present three dimensions, not because these dimensions are any way original or different, but I think when I frame the challenge, it's a way to, it's a taxonomy to organize my thoughts, so when I frame the challenges, I can refer back to these three pillars, as I call it. So the first pillar, I think, is the need to cultivate individual virtue and excellence. Again, this is very familiar to civil economy, to Adrian's work. From the idea that you want each person to unfold their capabilities, the ability to be or do what they value being or doing, amartya sen, but also a responsible use of this unfolding of capabilities, which gives rise to using it in line with virtue and excellence. That must guide all aspects of economic life, especially important in the vocational context, about meeting human needs in the context of meaning, purpose, dignity, and fulfillment. The second pillar, if that's the individual pillar, the second pillar I would argue is the social pillar, social virtues and institutions centered on the common good, so that capabilities once unfolded are directed towards the common ends of living the good life in community. And as Pope Francis tells us in Laudato Si, individual action alone is not enough for this. You also need institutional reform. And of course, if the institutions work well, that should help support and be supported by a strong foundation of social capital. The third pillar is material prosperity, which we can interpret in line with traditional economic concerns of economic growth, GDP and things like that. That's important, but it's only one of the three pillars, I would argue. It's, as Aristotle would say, it's necessary but not sufficient for well-being. And of course, economic growth that is not consistent with holistic human flourishing, that's not consistent with the common good, including in the context of the future generation, must be rejected. So if we have an economy based on these three pillars, whereby the ability to flourish in the personal dimension supports and is supported by the common good, that makes it easier to generate a virtuous cycle rather than this vicious crematistic cycle we have now when we only care about one pillar, that third pillar, and we completely ignore the other two vital dimensions. So that's, oh my God, look at the clock. Okay. Within that framework, I want to talk about what I regard are three of the main economic challenges today. I call it the 3 E's, employment, inequality, and environment. I think this really is a really good way of looking at it. And of course, it goes back to Laudato Si, talking about we face a joint social and environmental crisis. Starting with employment, neoclassical economics just treats labor as a factor of production that's paid its marginal product. If that's the only way you treat labor, you're missing something really crucial that, of course, it's a core source of human dignity and contribution to society. As Pope Francis says, jobs provide meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. And of course, we know this, we know from IMF research after the crisis that prolonged employment worsens your health, causes you to die younger, impedes the education of your children, and depletes trust and social capital, and also undermines democracy. And the literature on subjective well-being shows that, salary matters for happiness, but so does working conditions, autonomy, engagement, and social capital, that, that subsidiary common good that is unfolded in the workplace. Now, I don't need to describe the jobs crisis, the employment crisis we face today, because Jeff did that 2 days ago, and I would just be repeating him. So just to recap, when he talked about the trends of technology and globalization, which are really hurting both job prospects and wages, especially among low-skilled workers in developed economy, and that looks like it's only going to get worse in the years ahead. And I would add to that, There's also the political dimension of the attack on collective bargaining and worker rights, which just makes these economic dysfunctions way, way worse. So I think that this employment crisis hits the three pillars I mentioned. It hits all three pillars. One, it undermines the ability to unfold capability and achieve the intrinsic rewards of vocational attainment. Two, it undermines the common good, especially by hurting and undermining social capital, reducing trust and faith in institutions, and impeding the kinds of associational life that used to find form in occupational and vocational contexts, including, or especially in unions. And three, it hurts material prosperity, especially for lower income, lower skilled workers, the people that we're supposed to have a preferential option for. So it hits the negative trifecta. I would argue that the same is true for inequality. Many of the same trends which hurt employment are also creating this scandalous inequality and really widening income distribution within countries today. Things like globalization, things like technological change. Now here's the interesting part. We all know that the interesting part is inequality, once it gets in motion, it's really, really hard to reduce it because it's self-perpetuating. This was Thomas Piketty's argument, that capitalist modes of production means that inequality perpetuates itself. Well, I think, Branko Milanovic had a better argument, less mechanical, more human. He argued that even if inequality starts from economics, technology, and globalization, what happens is that it increases the political power of the elites to be able to bend policy to their will and reinforce the underlying inequality. And I would argue that that's exactly what we're seeing in the United States and other countries. So it might be started by globalization and technology, but it's certainly made worse by policies such as cuts in upper income and capital taxes, curbs on the bargaining power of labor, rollback of social protections, greater tolerance for monopolies and concentration, and looser restraints on financial innovation, all policies that benefit the rich and make inequality worse. I would argue that the real problem of inequality is that it severs the shared purpose necessary for unfolding the common good. I'm surprised at how few people frame it in that way today, because that's the way Plato and Aristotle framed it. The rich become too attached to their wealth rather than their civic obligations. Isn't that really what's going on? From the Milanovic story, I would argue that it is. So that, of course, is going to undermine trust and social cohesion, undermine the common good, and that's what we see. We see a lot of these social dysfunctions that Jeff Sachs mentioned, some of them, that can be really tied to this rising level of inequality, mistrust, dysfunction, and plutocratic capture. It also impedes not just the common good, but the individual good and capability for two reasons, I think. One is that, richer people, as I mentioned yesterday, responding to Luigino, there's evidence, psychological evidence, that the rich tend to, lack virtues, and when inequality is, widening, that dysfunction, I think, becomes more to the fore. And of course, the other issue is, as Jeff mentioned, inequality is tied to intergenerational mobility. The more inequality there is, the harder it is for people to move across generations, and that impedes the poor, the children of the poor, from being able to unfold their potential and develop their capabilities. They're really being held back, and I think that's one of the major scandals of inequality. So it really hits the two pillars of social virtue and individual virtue. And I would argue that it also hits negatively the third one, material prosperity, economic growth. We have a lot of evidence from the IMF now, despite what market ideology and neoliberalism said, rising inequality does not boost growth through incentives to work, save, and invest. It actually, in the current context, we must be contextual, right? In the current context, it makes economic growth worse. There are many reasons for that. I have 6, you might have your own. Some of them include, you're wasting the talents of the poor people, right? You're wasting the talents of the poor. You're undermining social cohesion and social capital, which leads to strife and political instability. Your corporate concentration means that you're stifling healthy competition and innovation, just replacing it with rent-seeking. Plutocratic capture means that you reduce both the will and the resources to make the kinds of investments needed to drive long-term growth in areas like sustainable development, decarbonization, and education, because the rich simply care about their own narrow interests, I would argue anyway. So again, you hit the negative trifecta. The environmental crisis is possibly even worse than those two crises. In 1936, John Maynard Keynes, at the end of his magnum opus, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, wrote the following. He said, "The outstanding faults of the economic society in which we live are its failure to provide full employment and its arbitrary and inequitable distribution of wealth and incomes." Employment and inequality. Same today as it was back in the 1930s, but one major difference. Keynes and his contemporaries did not have to deal with the environmental crisis that we have to deal with. You know, the environmental effects back then were more limited and more localized. Now we know differently. Now we know, as Jeff has pointed out many times, our global economy is 200 times larger today than it was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and it's set to increase threefold, even threefold more by the middle of the century, given, you know, the massive economic juggernaut that is putting immense pressure on the planet and the planetary boundaries, which are described so well in Laudato Si. And we all know what those planetary boundaries are, climate change being the most important one, but plenty of others too, like the attacks on biodiversity, pollution, deforestation, acidification. It's kind of amazing that Pope Francis managed to name every single one of these planetary boundaries, and yet his critics say he doesn't understand these issues. This, of course, is going to be devastating because the scientists tell us that we actually don't know the full implications of what's going to happen if we move from the current safe operating space of the Holocene, which we've had for 10,000 years, to the Anthropocene, something that, you know, is a system that we just don't know what's going to happen with unknown and uncertain, possibly catastrophic consequences. The economists that have tried to provide some, you know, guesses as to what might happen, it's very hard to do, but their best guesses are kind of terrifying. The famous Nick Stern report says climate change, the economic effects will be much larger than the 2 world wars and the Great Depression combined. Other studies say that, you know, the economy will be a quarter less, it will be reduced by a quarter across this century, and of course it's going to be the poorest countries in the world that get hit hardest. They already are. So these are the three major crises that we face today. And I think in each case, it's a textbook case of what happens when we don't take the oikonomia seriously as opposed to crematistica. It's a textbook case of what happens when we only look at economic growth and material accumulation over broader notions of human flourishing, especially in the context of individual good and the common good. This could get worse in the years ahead. These threats could even be magnified. You know, after the global financial crisis, Paul Krugman wrote an article in which he said, you know, this is not your father's crisis. This is your grandfather's crisis, or maybe even your great-grandfather's crisis, because this is something that we haven't seen since the 1930s, this kind of financial crisis. The crises that we've seen since the 1970s onwards are very different types of financial crises. I think Krugman was right. I think it's possibly the same today. I mean, I don't think Krugman could have seen this in 2009, but unfortunately we in 2017 can see this, is that it's also the same in politics. I think that the baby boom generation in particular likes to frame politics through the culture wars of the 1960s on both sides of the Atlantic. Whereas I think today, unfortunately, we need to look back to the 1930s for certain political developments, some of them quite scary and quite terrifying. Now, a lot of this is not to do with economics, and Jeff mentioned some of the issues there too, which I don't want to get into, but a lot of it is to do with economics. A lot of it is driven by what I just described: the faltering employment and income prospects of the low-skilled workers, deepening globalization that benefits the rich, in tandem with a retreat of the economic elites, the real winners, from any concerns about the common good. So this is where this backlash is coming from. It shouldn't really be surprising if we think that what we're hitting is not just income, we're actually hitting some very deep concepts of what it means to be a human being. I mean, that's no surprising that there's going to be a strong backlash if that's really what we believe in. So you know this. I mean, there's a backlash on trade. There's a backlash on financial globalization that we know from IMF studies shows that financial globalization across the world makes inequality worse, benefits the rich, especially by boosting the power of capital over labor. And we all know the implications of what that means in terms of worker rights, in terms of low tax havens and corporate taxes, and all kinds of things like this. Now, this backlash, sometimes it's directed against plutocrats and domestic elites, sometimes it's directed against immigrants and global financiers, but either way, it poses a major threat to domestic institutions. It also poses a threat to the institutions of the global common good, the post-war institutions, which, while not perfect, and while flawed in many ways, still managed to be better than nothing over the last half-century, I would argue. I think the 20th century gives us some very clear warnings here, back in the 1930s. The early decades of the previous century also saw similar trends, a retreat from globalization, either towards the nationalism of fascism or the radical leveling of communism. I'm not saying we're going to see something today, but we are seeing similar trends. The idea that that the adjustment in the global economic system has reached political and economic breaking point. And again, Branko Milanovic has argued that you can explain the First World War in the context of the dysfunctions brought about by soaring inequality. Hobson and Lenin made exactly the same arguments in their time. And he also argued that the only way historically the inequality falls is never for benign reasons. It's always due to things like wars and revolutions and massive social destruction. And in a very pessimistic take, Walter Scheidel wrote a recent book that goes all the way back to ancient Sumer to the 21st century to make a very similar argument that inequality only ever falls due to mass mobilization warfare, revolutions, state collapse, and major pandemics. Are we all suitably depressed at this point? And of course, we all know that advancing environmental degradation is only going to make this worse in terms of the political instability, the pressure on resources, the mass migration, the refugee crisis, and all of this instability that's going to go along with climate change if it's not being addressed over the next few decades, including in terms of conflict between religions. So what are we going to do about this? I proposed the final part of the paper is on policy responses, and I wanted, since the theme of the symposium is not just government policy, it's also the relationship and the interplay between market state and civil society, and I would argue that when you talk about government policies, we need to have a broader view here. It's not just what the government does itself, it's also the institutional framework by which the government affects what the private sector does, and even, I would argue, the inculcation of individual and social virtues. And I gave an example yesterday of how I think whether you increase or cut marginal tax rates on the rich directly affects the inculcation of virtue and social norms. But I think we really need to start thinking seriously about these global economic challenges through this lens of virtue economics, or whatever you want to call it, starting with employment. I like here very much Anthony Atkinson's proposal that government adopt an explicit unemployment target, and you basically hire workers at the minimum wage who otherwise can't find a job. That sounds very statist, but if we think employment is as crucial as it is, we need to think of some very radical solutions. And there are plenty of very good arguments here. I won't go through them all because there's a lot of policy proposals in this paper, none of which are original, by the way, but I think they're all good. For me, the important one is to reset the bargaining power between capital and labor, which is a much more institutionally effective means of delivering fair wages and just wages than the blunt instrument of minimum wages. Minimum wages are important, including through signaling virtue, but nothing can really beat the the vocational, the bargaining between capital and labor, which other speakers have referred to why this is important too. And I think that's absolutely crucial. I would refer to two other issues from Catholic social teaching: profit sharing, which is it can be very good, we all know. And I think with the modern sharing economy, with a corporate structure that's more horizontal than vertical, where workers own the capital already, to me that says sharing, profit sharing is an obvious way to run a company like Uber, but in fact the opposite happens. Instead you have the newest advances in information technology going hand in hand with the oldest forms of labor exploitation, unfortunately. I would also argue that the industrial relations model of co-determination, which Andre spoke of this morning, so I don't need to go into more detail there, but again, it's all about vocation, good practice, democratic participation, all that stuff that we think is important for the virtue economy. And Adrian's really good book from last year also has lots of stuff on that. I think we also need, where am I, 4 minutes, okay. The universal basic income, some people have argued that it's really good for dealing with this technological shifts today, in the sense of avoiding both poverty traps, whereby the gains of increasing work effort are outweighed by the loss of means-tested benefits, or avoiding stigmatization, where your dignity is the mean because you're identified as a loser. If you give everybody basic income, people argue, then it should be fine. Now, some have argued that basic income undermines the incentive to work. I don't buy that argument for one simple reason. If that were true, then the people who receive capital income would face similar temptations and should be equally criticized, but we never criticize people who earn capital income. But the real problem with universal basic income is it narrows the issue to one of income security over the broader ability to make a genuine social contribution and unfold capabilities. So I think it's much better to focus on the policies and institutions I've discussed here, allowing workers to share fairly in the creation and distribution of wealth, and then to complement these policies with the provision of universal benefits, such as healthcare, education, and child support. These are all employment policies, but they also will have an impact on inequality. And again, we all know that fiscal policies are important. I believe, for me, I think it's very important to reduce this, and I mentioned this yesterday too, this intergenerational propagation of privilege, which is endemic, core to the inequality problem, which to me tells what we need: high inheritance taxes, and maybe even Piketty's argument for a global tax on capital, no matter how unrealistic that might sound, or the Anthony Atkinson's proposal and others for a capital endowment to be paid to all upon the age of majority, which in my view is a much better argument than the universal basic income. There's also plenty of corporate governance arguments that other people have made that I won't repeat. I will mention that we need to also talk not just about fiscal policy here, we also need to talk about vigorous competition and antitrust, which Stefano mentioned yesterday, not just on grounds of efficiency, but also on grounds of distribution, breaking up monopolies and mergers in industries where they demonstrate harm to the common good, loosening intellectual property protections that just act more as a source of rents than value, and regulating these new platform monopolies, and I think we will hear about that later on, that are, again, harmful to the common good. And in the financial sector, I support what Paul and everybody else said, a financial transaction tax, and curbing this problem of too big to fail. I would call it too big to fail, jail, or curtail, right? These things are so powerful, and the implicit subsidy from too big to fail, by the way, according to certain studies, actually account for 100% of profits of the major banks. So their only source of profits is an implicit subsidy from the government. That tells you everything you need to know about the dysfunctions in this sector. This is ridiculous. 1 minute left, so I'm okay. And then on the policies for environment, I think there's really only one I want to talk about: carbon tax, carbon tax, carbon tax, carbon tax. That is, the most important policy. It's got to be done. It will affect not only incentives to move to a decarbonized economy, but it will also inculcate good social norms that, emitting carbon dioxide in today's world is not something that we should be encouraging, and we should be actively discouraging it through every means we can. Okay, I apologize if I went really fast, but I got through a lot of what to get through. So, okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.